Hello, Internet. There's a lot of revisionist history going around the past few months, so we need to have a talk about the Electoral College. Usually, the revisionists say something like, "This is Civics 101," while making claims that would fail them out of Civics 101. History is kind of my thing, and I don't like seeing it distorted this way, so let's look at what the founders actually said. They wrote in the modern era of widespread literacy and printing presses, so it's not like we have a scarcity of primary sources. The Constitution, the Federalist Papers, Poor Richard's letters to the editor, correspondence between one another, and various other words directly from their mouths. The founders' opinions are very well recorded. You can debate about whether or not they were right, but it is completely unambiguous what they said and believed. When someone talks about what the founders intended, they are not making a subjective argument. They are either wrong or right, usually wrong. There is no real debate to be had about this. Just liars, hoping that if they lie loud and long enough, people will believe them. So let's start with the easiest myth, that the Founding Fathers believed that electing the head of the executive branch by a direct popular vote would be a non-Republican form of government. This is completely false. The Constitution itself declares that popular elections are Republican. In the United States Constitution, Article 4, Section 4, it is written that, quote, "The United States shall guarantee to every state in this Union a Republican form of government, and shall protect each of them against invasion, and on application of the legislature or of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence." Close quote. I have given the complete section for the sake of full context, but the important part is that the Constitution guarantees to every state in the Union a Republican form of government. So how is the head of, let's say, Virginia's executive branch elected according to the Virginia State Constitution? Here's the complete text of Virginia's State Constitution, Article 5, Section 2, Election of Governor. Quote, "The governor shall be elected by the qualified voters of the Commonwealth at the time and place of choosing members of the General Assembly. Returns of the elections shall be transmitted under seal by the proper officers to the State Board of Elections, or such other officer or agency as may be designated by law, which shall cause the returns to be opened and the votes to be counted in the manner prescribed by law. The person having the highest number of votes shall be declared elected, but if two or more shall have the highest and an equal number of votes, one of them shall be chosen governor by a majority of the total membership of the General Assembly. Contested elections for governor shall be decided by a like vote. The mode of proceeding in such cases shall be prescribed by law." Close quote. So, Virginia's legislature, the General Assembly, set a time and place for the election. The qualified voters of the Commonwealth, that is, all citizens who meet legal requirements to vote, like age and not being an incarcerated felon and so on, they all vote on who they want for governor, and then the votes are counted and whoever has the most votes is governor, with the General Assembly only getting involved if there is an exact tie. In short, it's a popular vote. Virginia has a popular vote for head of the executive branch written into their constitution, and the United States Constitution guarantees that Virginia's government is and will forever be a republic. So according to the Constitution, government with a popularly elected head of the executive branch is a republic. When people tell you that a popular vote would be anti-republican, those people are lying. Let's look at another myth, that the Founding Fathers intended America to be a republic but not a democracy. This is also false. Typically, the Federalist Papers are cited for this. Actually, dishonest people usually declare this without citing anything at all and have no quotes at all when pressed for evidence. But the slightly more careful liars will usually cite, for example, this quote from James Madison's Federalist 48. Quote, "In a democracy where a multitude of people exercise in person the legislative functions and are continually exposed by their incapacity for regular deliberation and concerted measures to the ambitious intrigues of their executive magistrates, tyranny may well be apprehended on some favorable emergency to start up in the same quarter." To put this into modern language, if the people vote directly on legislation, then the executive branch in charge of enforcing that legislation might seize upon some emergency or crisis to convince the people to grant them tyrannical power. Regular people have regular jobs, which means they're vulnerable in times of crisis to simply not having time to hear a complicated but effective solution, and thus defaulting to the simple, straightforward, but wrong answers provided by would-be tyrants who use rhetoric to turn a fearful population into useful idiots for their ascent to the throne of monarch. James Madison understood this, so in Federalist 48 he argues against the people voting directly on legislation, and, in the following sentence, in favor of having an elected legislative body like Congress instead, a system which he calls representative republic. The first time James Madison or anyone else brings up democracy, it's in Federalist 10, when he explicitly calls it pure democracy specifically. Quote, "From this view of the subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit of no cure for the mischiefs of faction." Close quote. Later on in the same paper, he says, quote, "A republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect, and promises the cure for which we are seeking." Close quote. In future Federalist papers, James Madison refers to the form of government of all citizens assembling periodically to personally run the federal government as just a democracy. But this is just a shorthand. He's referring to pure democracy, not all democracy. The system James Madison was disparaging is that of citizens gathering to vote on individual laws, and the alternative he suggested was an elected Congress. So, does James Madison consider all democracies to be pure democracies? Does he think of the words as completely synonymous? Evidently not, because James Madison is the co-founder with Thomas Jefferson of the Democratic Republican Party. Both James Madison and Thomas Jefferson therefore clearly believe that a democratic republic is not a contradiction in terms, because they both support democracy and republicanism simultaneously. When someone tells you that America is a republic and not a democracy, they are lying to you. America is a republic and a democracy. Speaking of opposing the founders' vision, let's talk about the third myth, the structure of Congress. This is relevant to the Electoral College because each state gets electors in that college in proportion to their congressmen rather than their population, which is why someone can have a decisive loss in the popular vote, but a decisive win in the Electoral College. This is laid out in the Constitution in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2, quote, "Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors, equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress, but no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed elector." Close quote. The takeaway here being that a state's electoral college strength is directly proportionate to its congressional strength, so it matters how seats in Congress are parceled out, and how that works is a result of the Connecticut Compromise. The Connecticut Compromise was a compromise at the Constitutional Convention between two different plans for how states would be assigned congressmen. The New Jersey plan, supported by William Paterson, suggested that every state get 2 senators and that would be the end of it, just like the Continental Congress had worked during the Revolution and under the Articles of Confederation. The Virginia plan, proposed by Thomas Jefferson and supported by Alexander Hamilton, suggested that there would be 2 houses of Congress. The Senate would consist of congressmen appointed directly by state governments in proportion to the state's population, while the House of Representatives would consist of a popularly elected congressman also in proportion to the state's population. William Paterson was afraid that big states would gang up on smaller states, but Jefferson and Hamilton didn't think the big states had anything in common except having a large amount of land in them, which isn't a policy issue. Generally speaking, the North sided with Paterson and the South sided with Jefferson. Hamilton broke ranks with the New York delegation in his support of the Virginia plan because he had principles. Ultimately, Congress agreed to the Connecticut Compromise, in which the House was proportionate but the Senate was not, and later on the 17th Amendment made the Senate directly elected just like the House. The 17th Amendment was after the Founders' time, so we won't look at it right now. The important thing is this: Jefferson and Hamilton were right about big states, and Paterson was wrong about them. We made a nation, and we saw what happened, and what happened is what Jefferson and Hamilton predicted, not what Paterson predicted. In fact, that trend started in the argument between the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan. With the exception of Alexander Hamilton, the New York delegation supported the New Jersey plan, and New York was humongous for its time. Virginia was also a big state, and obviously the plan would not have been named for them if they didn't support it. Big states were already taking positions against one another in 1787, and the trend continued from then on. The 19th century was defined by North versus South. The modern landscape is about the coasts and the center, and there have always been big states on both sides. California is the biggest state by population and hasn't voted for a single Republican president since Ronald Reagan swept the nation in an actually historic Electoral College victory. Texas is the second biggest state by population and hasn't voted for a single Democrat since electing Jimmy Carter in 1976. Anyone who claims that California or Texas are swing states are deluded because they haven't swung in decades, and they're the 2 biggest states. If you look at the next 9 biggest states, which is all that's required to win the Electoral College, they're a collection of mostly swing states with a couple more Republican and Democratic states peppered in. William Paterson isn't a visionary or a genius the way the titans of America's founding were. He's not Thomas Jefferson or Alexander Hamilton. He's not Benjamin Franklin or James Madison, and he's certainly not George Washington. William Paterson is only remembered for forcing better men than him to compromise their vision. If someone tells you that supporting him against Jefferson and Hamilton means supporting the vision of the founders, they are lying to you. The Virginia plan was the founders' intent, and it would have made both Congress and the Electoral College proportionate to population. So, if Alexander Hamilton sided against the New Jersey plan, why did he want an electoral college at all? It was his idea, after all, and he explains why in Federalist 68. Quote, "It was desirable that the sense of the people should operate in the choice of the person to whom the office was to be confided. This end will be answered by committing the right of making it not to any pre-established body, but to men chosen by the people for that special purpose and at that particular conjuncture." Close quote. So, first of all, Alexander Hamilton clearly intended that people would vote for their electors, not for a specific presidential candidate. He goes on, quote, "It was equally desirable that the immediate election should be made by men most capable of analyzing the qualities adapted to the station and acting under circumstances favorable to deliberation, and to a judicious combination of all the reasons and inducements which were proper to govern their choice. A small number of persons, selected by their fellow citizens from the general mass, would be most likely to possess the information and discernment requisite to such complicated investigations." Close quote. In other words, Alexander Hamilton expected the Electoral College to be a group of people who were considered trustworthy enough to represent their constituents and perceptive enough to navigate the complicated investigations that he felt were necessary to the election of the president. George Washington was elected unanimously in the first two elections, but from 1796 on, the results of the Electoral College were considered unsatisfactory by its creators. Originally, each elector voted for two different presidential candidates, and the second most popular presidential candidate was vice president. But the emergence of political parties paired Federalist President John Adams with Democratic Republican Vice President Thomas Jefferson, and the extreme friction between the two gummed up the works of government. It could be argued that government having a hard time imposing its will on the nation is a feature, not a bug, but the political elite of the time disagreed, and instructed their electors to vote straight ticket in the next election. The Constitution permits states to appoint their electors however they like, so they are free to completely abandon Hamilton and Madison's vision of the Electoral College and appoint electors based on loyalty instead of popular vote. And as we've established, popular votes are Republican according to the Constitution. Factionalism, less so. This perversion of the Electoral College's original purpose resulted in a tie between the two candidates of the winning Democratic-Republican Party. In 1803, the 12th Amendment was ratified to prevent this kind of thing happening again by requiring electors to vote for one candidate for president and another for vice president, with no consolation prize for second place in either race. Now state electors were free to vote straight ticket without causing a tie between the two winning candidates. In the 1804 election, there was already a strong tendency towards states dedicating their entire electoral vote to a single presidential candidate rather than voting for electors district by district. So the 1804 election was the birth of the Electoral College as we know it today. How did James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, the designers of the Electoral College, feel about this? James Madison states his opinion in an 1823 letter, quote, "I agree entirely with you in thinking that the election of presidential electors by districts is an amendment very proper to be brought forward at the same time with that relating to the eventual choice of president by the House of Representatives. The district mode was mostly, if not exclusively, in view when the Constitution was framed and adopted, and was exchanged for the general ticket and the legislative election as the only expedient for baffling the policy of the particular states which had set the example." Close quote. In other words, winner-take-all races where entire states dedicate all their electoral votes to one victor was never the intention, nor was it intended that states appoint electors based on party loyalty over the will of the people. But once one state used the tactic, the others had to adopt it, or else their voting power would diminish. James Madison entirely agrees that this is terrible, and that a constitutional amendment should be ratified requiring electoral votes be proportionate and not winner-take-all. If someone tells you that the creators of the Electoral College supported and believed in the way it turned out in practice, they are lying to you. James Madison has explicitly said that the Electoral College he ended up with is not the one he wanted. Alexander Hamilton agreed and drafted an amendment hoping to fix it, but it went nowhere. The Electoral College we have today is not what the founders wanted. The founders never believed that a popular vote for an executive position was anything but Republican, never intended for electors to vote straight ticket, and never intended for Congress and the Electoral College to be disproportionate to population. The Electoral College we have today is not the founders' vision. It is a perverted distortion of their vision, an abomination that they tried to kill while they were still alive, and anyone who tells you otherwise is lying to you.